Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Chet Mishnah Vav. We are continuing to discuss the various halachot of distributing the Maaser Ani, the tithes that go to the poor. The Mishnah says, Midah zu amora b'kohanim u'balevim u'ba'Yisraelim. These minimum amounts of Maaser Ani, like we said previously, that a farmer has to give each poor person at the threshing floor, applies to all farmers, whether they are Kohanim, Leviim, or Yisraelim. Now, the Rav writes that the chidush of this Mishnah is the Torah tells us that Maaser Ani has to be given to a Levi. Right? It says, Lager, La Yatom, V'la Almana. Since Leviim are the recipients of Maaser Ani, and again, Kohanim are included in the group of Leviim, you might have thought that a Levi does not have to give Maaser Ani to others if he's a farmer. Since he gets Maaser Ani himself, you might have thought that if he's a farmer, he doesn't have to give it out to other poor people. Therefore, the Mishnah tells you that even a Levi or a Kohen must give Maaser Ani, just like a Yisrael must give Maaser Ani. The farmers have to give it equally, whether the farmer is a Yisrael, a Levi, or a Kohen. Now, the reason that Leviim receive Maaser Ani is because the Mefarshim explained that Leviim were not granted a portion in the land of Israel. They weren't given a part of Israel. Therefore, they were generally poor. We had to give them the Maaser Ani. That's why it's really singled out for Leviim. But again, the Mishnah says that every farmer, whether he's a Yisrael, a Levi, or a Kohen, must give out the Maaser Ani to the other Aniim, like we listed before. Now, Mishnah continues. Hayam Matzil. Let's say a farmer wanted to save some of his Maaser Ani for his poor relatives and friends who were not at the threshing floor at the time of the distribution. He's starting to give out. He realized, I don't see any of my friends and relatives who are poor. I want to save it for them. So the Mishnah says, Notel mechetza v'noten mechetza. He removes up to half of the Maaser Ani that he's distributing and he saves it for them. And the other half he distributes to the poor people who gathered at the threshing floor after he set aside his half. And the Rav explains, V'im la'achar shenatan mechza v'etznir etzorech krovav, hayalo davar mu'at. The Mishnah is going to say now, hayalo davar mu'at, if he only had a little bit remaining, noten lifnehem vehen mechalkin benehen. He puts it in front of the poor, and they will split it however equally amongst them. And the Rav explains as part of the Mishnah, Im la'achar shenatan mechza v'etznir etzorech krovav, hayalo davar mu'at, if after separating half, up to half, and saving it for his poor relatives and friends, he sees that he only has a little bit remaining. He doesn't have enough to give each poor person at the threshing floor the minimum that we stated in the previous Mishnah. So he puts the remaining of what he has in front of them, and they will split it amongst them equally. So the Mishnah tells us he could take up to half of his produce and save it for his poor friends and family. If the other half that's remaining is not enough to give out to the remaining poor people, like in the amount that the Mishnah said previously, put it in front of them, let them distribute it amongst themselves equally. That is the end of Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Zayin is going to discuss now distributing other charity funds. We do not give a poor person who is traveling from place to place less than mikikar bepundion me'arbasin besela. Now this is a specific measurement because we're going to see that the local charity has to give at least a amount of bread that is enough for 2 meals, the normal amount that a person eats each day. So it gives us this amount in their times. Mikikar pundion, a loaf of bread that costs a pundion, me'arbas sin besela, at a time when 4 se'ah of wheat cost a selah. And then the Mefarshim explained the math that when wheat is at this price of 4 se'ah for a selah, 1 pundion will buy a loaf of bread that has a quarter kav of flour. Now you give each person each poor person this size of bread, regardless of the price of wheat. You have to give a loaf that has a quarter kav of flour. Now the Mishnah previously, if you remember in Mishnah Hey, told us that you only have to give half a kav of wheat. So how is the Mishnah here saying you give him a quarter kav over there of flour? Over there it says you give him half a kav of wheat. You're going below the minimum. So the Rav explains that when it said half a kav of wheat, it was talking about unprocessed wheat, because the process of turning wheat into flour and then into bread cost the poor person half of his flour. Therefore, when we give him the ready bread, half a kav of flour wheat will equal a quarter kav of bread. That is what we give him. So again, Rabotai, the point is that a poor person that travels through the town, the traveler that passes through the town, the local charity has to give him at least this amount of bread, which is enough for 2 meals. The normal amount the person eats each day. The Mishnah continues, Lan If he stays in the town overnight, notnim lo parnasat lina. If he sleeps in the town overnight, you have to give him enough for the night, meaning the Rav explains a place to sleep, a bed, and bedding. Notnim lo mezon Shabbat. The Mishnah says if he stays for Shabbat in the town, notnim lo mezon shalosh seudot, we give him enough food for 3 meals instead of 2, because the Rav explains Shabbat we have that extra meal of Seudah Shlishit. The Mishnah now discusses 2 different types of charity funds. One we have was called the Tamchui. The Tamchui was a fund prepared for of prepared food that was distributed to poor travelers who had no food. Now the Mishnah says, Mi sheyesh lo mazon shtei seudot lo yitol min hatamchui. A poor person, a poor traveler who has enough food for 2 meals cannot take from the charity plate. And the Rav explains why. Lefi she'tamchui mitchalek bechol yom, since the Tamchui charity plate was distributed every day. Shagabayim machzirim al pitche baalei batim bechol yom. The charity collectors, the gabayim, would knock on the baalei batim, the workers' doors each day. Velokchim mehem tavshir tzorech anim. They would take food from them for the poor people. That plate they would use was called a tamchui. And again, the poor person who has 2 meals cannot take, because since he has enough food for that day, he cannot take from the plate, because the plate is being given out to other poor people who don't have food from that day. So as long as he has food for that day, he cannot take from this plate. However, we have another charity fund which was called the Peah, to which each family in the town contributed a fixed amount of money every Friday. The money was distributed to the poor residents of the town to cover the cost of meals for the coming weeks. So the Mishnah says, Mizon 14 seudot lo yiton meno kupah. A person who has enough food for 14 meals, which is 2 times the 7, he cannot take money from the charity box, because the fund is designated solely for people who cannot afford meals for the coming week, and he has 14 meals, which is for the coming week. 14 meals, enough to last through a week, 2 meals a day. Now, even though the Mefarshim do point out, even though Shabbat you need 3 meals, so he is missing 1 meal, really should be having 15. So the Mishnah says, the Mefarshim explain, that his 14 meals is enough, because that second meal he can have late enough in the day where it'll count for Seudah Shlishit, and he won't have to eat that night as well. Now, even though a person, the Tosfot Yom Tov points out, has to eat Milaveh Markat, the meal after Motzei Shabbat, if he cannot afford it, he does not knock on doors for that. So the 14 meals, if he has, suffices for him for the entire week. He cannot take from the kupah. The Mishnah says regarding the charity box, the money for the charity box has to be collected by a team of 2 collectors. And the Mefarshim explained, the Rav writes, because the collectors have the legal authority to tax the townspeople to contribute money to this fund, which supports the poor for the entire week. And the rule is that a tax must be collected by a minimum of 2 people. We're going to see this in Masechet Shkalim Bezrat Hashem. It's in Perek Hey, Mishnah Bet. It says that it's a principle. Any position that carries authority to raise money from the public must be shared by at least 2 people. They learned this out from a pasuk in the Torah. So since the charity collectors can force the people to give the funds, there has to be at least 2 of them. The money from the charity box must be distributed to the poor by a panel of 3 people. And the Rav says, because since each poor person's needs must be assessed, you have to figure out to determine how much money he deserves, because it's for the coming week. If he doesn't have whatever he doesn't have, the distribution of the money is considered a status of monetary judgment. And the Rav says, "V'dinei mamonot b'shlosha," that laws of money, judgment regarding money, cannot be made by less than 3 people. Therefore, it is when it is distributed by no less than a panel of 3 people. That is the end of today's Mishnah. Amen v'amen.